The recording was already running when I entered the chamber. That detail matters, because the council needed to see it from the beginning. Not from the moment I arrived at the field station. Not from the point at which Corpsman Selif Markov was brought in under loose escort. From the exact instant the last exchange of fire at Verith Station 7 went quiet, and the dust began to settle. I had reviewed the footage 47 times by the time I stood before the 7-seat board at Vithori Karath, and I had flagged it as a Priority 1 behavioral anomaly rather than a standard tactical incident, not because of anything the human had done during the fighting, but because of what she did in the 11 seconds immediately after it stopped. Council Chair Ovrath Dim asked me to begin at the beginning. I told him the beginning was not where he expected it to be. There were 12 of us on the ground at Verith Station 7. 4 Dominion field troopers, 3 logistics auxiliaries, a pair of communications techs, 2 medical personnel including myself, and a junior armaments officer named Sethrin Vel, who had never been in a contested zone before and who made the mistake, roughly 40 minutes into our assessment of the station, of opening a sealed interior corridor without waiting for the all-clear from the sweep team. What came out of that corridor was not the equipment cache the pre-mission survey had predicted. It was a human special operations cell, 4 individuals, who had apparently been using the station as a transit waypoint, and who responded to Sethrin Vel's interruption with the kind of immediate, decisive, overwhelming violence that human special operations personnel are specifically trained to produce. The exchange lasted 9 seconds. I know this because the station's internal sensor array was still active and logged it. At the end of those 9 seconds, 2 of my troopers were down, Pelithsar with a severe impact injury to his left primary limb assembly, and Gall with a puncture wound to the lower thorax that I would later spend 42 minutes trying to close. Sethrin Vel was unconscious against the far wall, which may have been the most fortunate outcome available to him, given what was about to occur. 4 human operators had taken no casualties. They had, in 9 seconds, assessed a room containing 12 armed Dominion personnel and neutralized the functional threat of it while sustaining 0 injuries to themselves. I want to be precise about that 9-second window because the council kept returning to it during my debrief as though it was the most significant piece of footage in the record. It wasn't. It was, in fact, entirely consistent with Dominion intelligence assessments of human special operations capability. There was nothing in those 9 seconds that the board had not seen before, in other after-action reviews, in training material, in the standing threat assessments, that every field medical auxiliary receives before deployment to a contested zone. Human special operations personnel are fast, precise, and lethal. The Dominion has known this for a long time. What the Dominion did not know, what I did not know, what no document in our threat assessment library had prepared me for, was what happened in the 11 seconds immediately after. The human designated in Dominion records as Corpsman Selif Markov was not part of the Special Operations Cell. She had been moving separately through the station's secondary corridor network, apparently providing trailing medical support to the cell's transit. And she arrived in the key assessment room approximately 11 seconds after the last sound of the engagement. I know her arrival time, precisely because it is on the recording. She was not armed in any significant sense. She carried a standard configuration human field medical rig, a hard-sided carry case with a biometric lock, a series of soft pouches along a torso harness, a folded trauma stabilization kit on her left thigh. She was approximately 28 years of age. By human reckoning, medium build, wearing the muted gray-green field uniform of the Terran Expeditionary Medical Corps, with no rank insignia visible at a distance. She had dark hair cut short at the sides, longer on top, slightly displaced by whatever she had been doing in the secondary corridor. Her face, when the sensor array captured it, was not the face of someone who had just been adjacent to a violent engagement. It was focused. It was calm. She entered the room, took approximately 2 seconds to read it, and went directly to Pelithsar. Not to her own people. Not to check on the 4 operators she had been traveling with, all of whom were unhurt. She went to Pelithsar. He was a Dominion field trooper. He was wearing Dominion field armor, with active unit identification markers on the shoulder assembly. He was holding the collapsed remnants of the Krev pattern sidearm that had been in his hand when the engagement started and that had done him exactly no good. She would have known, looking at him, what he was, what unit he was attached to, what flag he served under, and what his 4 colleagues and he had been doing in that room when her people arrived. She went to him anyway. That was the 11 seconds. She had her case open, and a pressure-binding kit deployed before any of the surviving Dominion personnel had recovered enough to respond to her presence. She said something to Peleth Sar. The sensor array's audio was partially damaged, and I did not recover a clean transcript of those words until my 4th review of the recording. And then she was working. Her hands were precise. Her movement around his injury was economical, in the way that only real clinical experience produces. The kind of economy that doesn't need to think about what it's doing, because it has done it thousands of times, and the thinking has long since been absorbed into the body. I watched that footage 47 times and I still have difficulty articulating what, specifically, made it so disorienting to observe. The council chair asked me to try. I told him it was the simultaneity of the information. Peleth Sar was an enemy combatant and she knew it, and she treated him anyway. She did not treat him provisionally. She did not treat him in the way that you might treat something you are uncertain about. Hedging. Doing the minimum. Keeping one hand free. She treated him with the full application of her training, her equipment, and her attention. Other team members had set up a loose perimeter at the room's exits. Standard cover behavior. But Markov was entirely focused on the wound in front of her. She had, in a practical sense, made herself the most vulnerable person in that room in order to help the most severely injured person in that room. And the most severely injured person in that room was someone who had been trying to kill her people 11 seconds earlier. Council member Drevath Seln, who holds the Dominion's senior chair in behavioral xenoscience, asked me at this point whether I believed the act was tactical. I told him I would come back to that. What happened in the 20 minutes that followed Markov's arrival was, from a medical standpoint, unremarkable. She stabilized Peleth Sar's limb injury with a combination of compression binding and 2 injections that our later analysis identified as a broad-spectrum vasoconstricting agent and a neural block compound of human manufacture, neither of which were precisely calibrated to Dominion physiology, but both of which, as best we could determine, she had adapted on the fly, using what she knew about the wound in front of her. She was not working from a Dominion medical reference. She was working from observation, inference, and whatever cross-species emergency protocols the Terran Medical Corps apparently builds into its field, training. She got the bleeding under control. She assessed the secondary injury, a fracture in the limb's structural support assembly, visible through the torn armor, and immobilized it with a splint from her kit. A splint designed for a human limb but improvised into sufficient function and around a Dominion one, because she cut it and bent it and adjusted it until it worked. Peleth Sar in his post-incident statement said, she spoke to him throughout, not instructions, not demands. Something quieter than that. He does not speak the human language. And she does not speak Dominion field standard. He said the tone of it was the same tone he associated with the medical technicians at his home station, the ones who worked the overnight intake desk, the ones who had seen too many injuries to be frightened by them, and whose voices, as a result, had taken on a specific quality. The quality of someone who is completely present with you and completely unafraid of what they are looking at. He said it was the most unsettling experience of the engagement, not the 9 seconds, the 20 minutes. I have been a field surgeon in the Dominion Medical Auxiliary for 11 years. I have treated species from 14 distinct taxonomic families. I have worked in contested zones on 6 different worlds, 2 of them active combat theaters at the time of my deployment. I have a reasonably well-calibrated sense of what constitutes a genuine behavioral anomaly versus what constitutes a situation I have not personally countered, but which falls within the range of behaviors I would predict for a given species under a given set of pressures. I want to be honest with the council about what I observed when I entered the primary assessment room and found Markov working on Peleth Sar. I was not prepared for it. Not the fact of it. I had heard, in the general circulation of field intelligence, human medical personnel sometimes treated non-human casualties in mixed engagement scenarios, and I had filed that information in the part of my memory that holds things that are interesting but not operationally significant. Theme. I had not thought carefully about what it would look like in practice. I had not thought about what it would feel like to walk into a room where human a human whose species had just 9 seconds before my arrival demonstrated with absolute clarity that it was capable of lethal violence on a very short timescale, was sitting on the floor next to an injured Dominion soldier, working, focused, calm, and in no apparent distress about any of the circumstances that surrounded her. She looked up at me when I entered. She registered that I was medical personnel. I was wearing my auxiliary markings and carrying my kit, which is standard in my role. And she said something in the human language that our interpreter unit, once I deployed it, rendered as, "I've got this one. Yours is in the corner." That was it. That was the entirety of her engagement with my arrival. She had assessed me, determined I was useful, allocated me an assignment, and returned to her work. She meant Orthgal. He was in the corner she had indicated, conscious but in poor condition, the puncture wound in his lower thorax having moved past manageable and into concerning while the engagement sorting been underway. I went to him. I worked on it, and for the next 42 minutes, Corpsman Selamarkov and I worked in the same room, on opposite sides, each treating a casualty from the other's force, and the only communication between us was clinical. She called over twice. Once to ask if I had a specific compression agent. She indicated the compound type by holding up the container from her own kit, and I understood from context what she needed, and I had the equivalent in Dominion formulation. And I gave it to her, and she used it, and something brief that the interpreter rendered as, "Good, thank you," once to tell me that Pelethsar's neural signs were destabilizing in a way she did not have the equipment to fully address, and that if I had a Dominion-calibrated neural support unit in my kit, I should use it. Because she had done what she could and it was not going to be enough. I used it. It stabilized him. Both of them lived. I am telling the council this not because the survival outcome is the anomaly. It is not. Field medicine produces survivors. But because the council needs to understand what the working condition inside that room was. There were 4 human special operations personnel maintaining a perimeter at the exits. There was a Dominion field medical officer treating a Dominion casualty. There was a human corpsman treating a different Dominion casualty. We were, by any formal definition, adversaries in an active contested zone. None of the 4 human operators interfered with my work. Markov did not interfere with my work. I did not interfere with hers. The room functioned for 42 minutes as a field hospital. I want the council to sit with that for a moment before I continue. Dravath Seln asked, when the recording paused at the 42-minute mark, whether I had considered the possibility that this was a deliberate tactic, that Markov was performing care as a calculated method of establishing will, gathering intelligence, demonstrating a form of psychological leverage. I told him I had considered it. I told him I had, in fact, spent a substantial portion of those 42 minutes considering it, because it was the explanation that made the most tactical sense, and because tactical sense is what field personnel reach for, first when confronted with behavior they do not understand. The problem with the tactical performance theory, I told him, is that it requires the performance to be distinguishable from the genuine article. I have treated thousands of patients across 11 years of field medicine. I know what clinical care looks like when it is executed with genuine intent, and I know what it looks like when it is being mimicked for social or political effect. The mimicry is always slightly off. The attention drifts at the wrong moments. The hands move with the right shapes, but not with the right instinct. The voice carries the correct cadence, but not the correct weight. Markov's care did not have those signatures. Her attention did not drift. Hands had the instinct, her voice, and I am going by Pelethsar's account here, since I was not in a position to observe her throughout, carried the weight of genuine clinical presence. She was not performing care. She was delivering it. Dravath Seln said that was a subjective assessment. I agreed. I told him we would come to the objective data shortly. The council chair asked me to continue the chronology. At the 53-minute mark, a Dominion quick response unit arrived at Vareth Station 7 in response to the emergency beacon that one of the surviving communications technicians had managed to activate before losing consciousness. The 4 human operators, reading the incoming force signatures, chose to withdraw rather than contest the space. They did so efficiently and without apparent stress. They were gone before the first QR trooper breached the exterior access point. Markov did not go with them. She was still working on SAR when the QR unit came through the door. She stayed with her hands on her patient. She did not reach for anything that could be construed as a weapon. She did not move toward an exit. She said something to the lead trooper. The interpreter later rendered it as, "He needs evacuation within the hour. His vascular pressure is compensating, but it won't hold past 90 minutes in this temperature." Then she sat back from Peleth SAR, placed her hands flat on her thighs where they were clearly visible, and waited. The QR unit took her into custody. She came without resistance. She asked, twice during the processing period, whether Peleth SAR was going to be evacuated in time. Both questions were ignored by the processing troopers. She stopped asking after the second time, not because she had been told anything, but apparently because she had decided that asking further was not useful. She was transported to the Dominion Forward Assessment Station at Kithelvar, and that is where I encountered her again. 3 days later, when I had completed my own post-incident processing and had been assigned to the behavioral review team, I want to note for the council that Markov's behavior during the 3 days at Kithelvar is documented in the supplementary file, and I can walk through it in detail if the board requires it, but the core of it can be summarized briefly. She was cooperative, calm, and medically observant. She flagged on the second day that one of the other detained personnel, a Dominion Logistics Auxiliary who had been brought in from a separate incident and who was housed in an adjacent processing cell, was showing signs of a respiratory complication that required attention. She communicated this to the duty officer through the cell partition using a combination of spoken words and clear physical indication. The duty officer eventually relayed it. The auxiliary was assessed and found to have a developing respiratory obstruction that, left unattended for another 6 hours, would have required significantly more intensive intervention. Markov had noticed. She had communicated it. She had done this for someone she had never met, who was housed in the adjacent cell, in a detention facility where she herself was being held. Dreveth Seln asked whether she might have been attempting to build credit with her captors. I told him that was one possible interpretation. I told him I had asked her, directly when I met with her on the 3rd day. This is the part of my testimony that I want the council to wait carefully, because it is where the objective data begins. I sat across from her at the processing table in Kethelvarl's secondary interview room. I had an interpreter unit active. I introduced myself as a field medical officer. I told her I was reviewing the events at Vareth Station 7 and that I had some questions about her there. She said that was fine. She said it the way that someone says something when they have already decided to be honest about it. I asked her why she had treated Peleth SAR. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "He was the most badly hurt person in the room." I asked her whether she had considered that he was a Dominion soldier. She said yes. I asked her whether that had been a factor in her decision. She looked at me again. The look was not hostile. It was the look of someone encountering a question they have to think about, because it is not a question they have thought about in exactly that form before. Not because it is a difficult question, because the answer is so fundamental to how they operate that they have never had to state it explicitly, she said. He was hurt. I'm a medic. That was the entire answer. She offered nothing else. She did not seem to feel that anything else was required. I told the council that I sat with that answer for a considerable period of time, and that what I kept returning to was not the content of the answer, but the structure of it. She had not said I treated him because I hoped it would help my situation. She had not said I treated him because it was tactically advantageous. She had not said I treated him because I was afraid of what would happen if I didn't. She had said he was hurt and she was a medic, and from her perspective, Those two facts contained everything necessary to explain the action. I asked her a follow-up question. I told her that in Dominion medical training, we are taught a formal triage principle that distinguishes between casualties from our own force, casualties from allied forces, and casualties adversarial forces, and that the priority of care follows that sequence, whether the Terran Medical Corps operated under a similar framework. She said they had a similar framework. She said it was called a mass casualty triage protocol, and it existed to help allocate scarce resources under conditions of overwhelming demand. I asked her whether she had applied that framework at Vareth Station 7. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There were 2 badly hurt people, and 2 medics. There wasn't a resource problem." I asked her what she would have done if there had been a resource problem, if the choice had been between treating a Dominion casualty and treating one of her own people. She said she would have treated her own people first. I asked her whether she would have then gone back for the Dominion casualty. She said, "If there was time and they were still alive and I could help." "Yes," I asked. "Even in an active engagement," she said. "The engagement was over." I noted that this was a very particular distinction. She nodded. Told the council that I had run this exchange through Dominion Behavioral Analysis software. The Kethavar 4 suite is our current standard for cross-species behavioral assessment, and that the software had flagged the exchange as unclassifiable under our existing behavioral taxonomy. This is not a common outcome. The Kethavar 4 suite has a library of approximately 400,000 behavioral profiles across every species with which the Dominion has had extended contact. It has a residual unclassifiable rate of less than 2% for observed behaviors in interview contexts. Could not classify what Markov had described. Not because it was too complex, because it did not fit any of the motivational frameworks in the library's structure. The library is built around the assumption that behavior in adversarial contexts is driven by some combination of self-interest, group interest, ideological obligation, or threat response. Markov's behavior at Vareth Station 7 did not resolve cleanly into any of those categories. She had not treated Plesar because it benefited her position. She had not treated him because it benefited her unit's position. She had not treated him out of ideological commitment to a neutral medical role. She was not a field hospital attached to a neutral party. She was the organic medical asset of a special operations cell engaged in a hostile operation. She had treated him because he was hurt. The software's output, and I have the raw report in the supplementary file if the council wishes to review it, was 3 words. It generated 3 words as its best fit classification. No applicable category. The council chair called a recess at this point. It was not a scheduled recess. He simply said the word, and the board rose. And we stood in small clusters in the antechamber for approximately 12 minutes. I have attended a great many Dominion review proceedings at various levels of the authority structure, and I have never seen an unscheduled recess called at the 2-hour mark of a debrief. I noted it because I thought it was significant. I think the council chair needed 12 minutes to decide what kind of meeting he was still in. When we reconvened, Seln asked the question I had expected him to ask. He asked me how confident I was that the Kethavar 4 output represented a genuine classification failure rather than a software limitation. He said it with the careful neutrality that behavioral scientists use when they are about argue that a result is an artifact rather than a finding. I told him I had anticipated that question and had prepared for it. I told him that before bringing this matter to the council, I had requested access to Dominion Field Medical Incident reports from contested zones. Human medical personnel had been present. I was looking for similar incidents. I did not expect to find many. I found 117, spanning 14 contested zones, 11 discrete engagement incidents, and 9 years of field reporting. 117 documented instances of human medical personnel providing care to Dominion or Allied force casualties in adversarial or post-adversarial contexts without being ordered to do so, without receiving any benefit for doing so that was documented in the record, and in several cases, under conditions, where doing so represented a meaningful personal risk to the human providing the care. Seln was silent for a moment. Then he said he would want to review the incident reports individually before accepting the synthesis as evidence of a pattern. I told him that was his prerogative, and that the complete annex was available to him. He spent 6 minutes reviewing the summary index on his console. I watched him do it. He pulled up 4 reports at random. The Sethvar crossing incident, the Kolith 9 station encounter, the Oravan field hospital overlap, and a smaller incident from the contested belt at Dreven Sect, and read the relevant sections. Then he set his console down. He said, "These reports were filed as standard post-incident notes." I said, "Yes." He said, "Nobody connected them before." I said, "No. They were invisible in the data because nobody was looking for a pattern. They had each processed as an individual incident and archived. Pattern only becomes visible when you put them in sequence." He was quiet. I told the council that the reports were not anomalies. They were evidence of a consistent behavioral tendency. And the consistency was the part that mattered, because a pathological behavior, a malfunction, a psychological deviation, does not appear consistently across 117 separate incidents involving different human individuals, in different theaters, under different operational conditions. Pathological behavior clusters around individuals or specific units under specific stressors. A consistent pattern across this many data points, this widely distributed, means you are looking at something species level. Council member Sethorvith, who holds the Dominion's senior chair in tactical xenobiology, asked me at this point what the operational implication was. Said it in the way that military people say things when they are asking a medical person to tell them something useful rather than something. I told him the operational implication was that human medical personnel are not functioning as a support asset in the conventional sense. In Dominion tactical doctrine, medical personnel are a force multiplication asset. They preserve the combat effectiveness of their own unit. The logic of their role is entirely internal to the force they serve. Their calculus is, keep our people functional, so our people can continue to fight. The care they extend to adversarial casualties is, in our doctrine, largely incidental. Governed by formal rules of conduct that established minimum standards of treatment, rules that are followed because they are required, not because there is a spontaneous drive toward them. Human medical personnel apparently do not function on that logic. Their logic, as far as I can reconstruct it from Markov's interview and from the pattern in the 117 cases, appears to be simpler and more absolute. Hurt person, medic. Those 2 facts generate an action, and the action is largely independent of the third fact, which side the hurt person is on. The third fact influences priority under resource constraints. It does not eliminate the action. Sethorvith said, "So what does that mean for us?" I told him it meant that we did not fully understand what we were dealing with. I told him that the Dominion had spent 43 years building a threat model for human combatants that was based on the assumption that their violence and their care were directed at different objects. Violence at adversaries, care at allies. Those 2 drives pointed in opposite directions, and the vector of each told us something useful about how they would behave. We could predict, with reasonable confidence, the conditions under which a human unit would engage, and the conditions under which it would withdraw. We could predict how they would protect their wounded. We could predict how they would respond out to the wounding of adversaries. Those predictions were reasonably accurate. What we had not modeled, what the Kethavar 4 suite could not classify, was a species in which those 2 drives do not consistently point in opposite directions. A species in which the capacity to kill and the capacity to heal operate from the same engine, and the engine does not distinguish between the object in front of it based on what flag that object serves. Drevath Seln said, "I want to return to the interview record. You had a second session with Markov. What came out of it?" I told the council that the second session had been the more productive of the 2. Not because she was more forthcoming, because I had arrived with better questions. I had, between the first and second sessions, reviewed the complete personnel file that Dominion Intelligence maintained on Markov. She had served 8 years in the Terran Expeditionary Medical Corps, the last 4 as a forward deployment corpsman attached to Special Operations units. She had been in 11 contested engagements prior to Verith Station 7. She had treated, by the records we had access to, 100 patients in field conditions. Dominion Intelligence had not thought to flag her file before Verith Station 7 because she was medical support. Medical support was not a threat assessment priority. That was, I told the council, first of several things we had gotten wrong. In the second session, I asked her about the 11 other engagements. I asked her whether she had treated non-human casualties in those engagements as well. She said yes, when there was time and when the casualties were not at immediate risk from nearby hostile activity. I asked her how many. She thought about it. She said she didn't keep a precise count because the count wasn't the relevant variable. The relevant variable was whether the person in front of her needed help and whether she could provide it. I told her that from the Dominion's perspective, the count was somewhat relevant. She understood that, and she was sorry she couldn't give me a precise number. I asked her whether she had ever been ordered not to treat non-human casualties. She said there was a standing guideline that prioritized human casualties in resource-limited situations, and that prohibited treating adversarial casualties when doing so created a tactical risk to her unit. I asked her whether those guidelines had been in effect at Verith Station 7. She said the resource situation was not limited and her assessment saw that the tactical risk was low, so the guideline had not applied. I asked her what she would have done if her commanding officer had been present and had ordered her not to treat Peleth Sar. She was quiet for a longer time than usual. Then she said, I would have had to weigh that. I asked her what the weights were. She said, the order against the wound in front of me. I asked her which would have won. She looked at me steadily. She said, that would depend on the wound. I reported this to the council, and I told them I believed it. I did not believe it because I thought Markov was insubordinate or undisciplined. Every other aspect of her record argued against that. I believed it because it was consistent with the underlying structure of everything else she had said. The wound in front of her was a real thing, immediate and demanding, and it produced a real pull, and that pull existed independently of the authority structure around it. The authority structure could channel it and constrain it under certain conditions. It could not eliminate it. This is the part I kept returning to in the days between the sessions and the debrief. We model compliance in other species as a primary behavior, and deviation as a secondary exception-driven behavior. The default state is compliance with authority structure. Deviation requires a sufficiently large exception condition to override it. What Markov was describing was something closer to a parallel system. Two simultaneous evaluations running at the same time, one tracking the authority structure, and one tracking the wound in front of her, and the outcome of any given decision depending on the relative weight of the two inputs, rather than on one simply overriding the other. Two evaluations, running simultaneously, neither subordinate to the other by default. I had not previously encountered a species that was built this way. I told the council that this was the observation I found most difficult to communicate in clinical language, because our clinical language for behavior assumes a hierarchy of drives. We assume that every species, in a conflict situation, is running one primary evaluation and suppressing the others. We model behavior as sequential, threat assess, then respond to dominant drive, then permit secondary behaviors to activate as conditions allow. Entire behavioral prediction architecture rests on this. Markov was not sequential. She threat assessed and wound assessed in parallel. Both outputs were live simultaneously, and in the absence of a strong priority condition, both could act simultaneously, which is why she had been for 42 minutes, a medic and an adversary at the same time in the same room, and had found this entirely unremarkable. Sath Orvith said, she stayed behind when her unit withdrew. That is not the behavior of someone running a threat assessment. I told him I thought she had run the threat assessment and reached a different conclusion than he was expecting. He said, explain. I told him that from Markov's perspective, the tactical situation at the 53-minute mark was this. Her unit was withdrawing. Peleth Sar was not yet stable enough to safely transfer. If she withdrew, he would likely die before the QR unit arrived with adequate medical support. If she stayed, she would be taken into custody by the QR unit, But custody was not a fatal outcome, and it was one she could manage. She had weighed those two outcomes and chosen the one that preserved Pelithsar. He was quiet, I told him. She stayed, because the wound in front of her had not resolved. She calculated that she could survive custody. She calculated that Pelithsar could not survive her departure. She chose accordingly, he said. That is a rational actor analysis. I said yes. He said, you are saying she made a rational decision to prioritize a Dominion casualty over her own freedom. I said, I am saying she made a rational decision consistent with her values. Her values happen to include Dominion casualties in a category we do not typically include in a threat actor's rational calculus. He sat back. I told the council that this was the operational implication Sath Orvith had asked about, stated plainly. When you are assessing human behavior in a contested zone, you cannot assume that your casualties are outside their calculus. They may be inside it. Not as obstacles, not as liabilities, not as leverage, as patients. A species that includes its enemies in its medical calculus will behave unpredictably by any model that does not account for this. They will stay when you expect them to withdraw. They will share resources across adversarial lines. They will make decisions that appear irrational from a conventional force preservation standpoint, and that are, in fact, entirely rational from a standpoint that includes a broader definition of who matters. We do not know how broadly that definition extends. We do not know its outer limit. That is the thing that kept me awake. I want to explain to the council why this result kept me awake, in case the framing of a behavioral anomaly report has made it seem more academic than it is. The Dominion has been studying human behavior as a formal academic discipline for 43 years. In that time, we have assembled what I believe to be the most comprehensive non-human behavioral database on any species in this region of the galaxy. We know their physiology in significant detail. We know their combat doctrine. We know their diplomatic patterns, their cultural variation, their political structures. We have threat models. We have prediction engines. We have risk assessment frameworks for every major category of human behavior that has been observed in the field, in captivity, in diplomatic context, and in contested zones. The database has a gap. The gap is this. We modeled humans as a species capable of extreme violence and extreme restraint, often in rapid alternation. We modeled the violence. We modeled the restraint. We did not model the thing that sits between them. The thing that is not restraint, exactly. Because restraint is the suppression of an impulse. And what Markov demonstrated was not the suppression of anything. It was the active expression of something. A positive outdrive. A capacity that runs concurrently with the capacity for violence, and does not cancel it, and is not canceled by it. She had been medically useful to those 4 operators for the duration of their transit. She was their medical asset. She was, by any functional definition, a combatant-adjacent member of an adversarial force. And when the fighting stopped and a Dominion soldier was badly hurt, the thing in her that was a medic did not wait for the thing inside her that, attached to an adversarial force, to stand down first. They were not in sequence. They were simultaneous. Drevethseln raised at this point possibility that this was a pathology, that Markov was exhibiting behavior atypical of her species, that she was in some sense malfunctioning, that her inability to suppress the medical drive in the presence of an enemy casualty represented a psychological or neurological deviation from normal human function. I told him I had considered that possibility and that I had rejected it. I told him I had rejected it for 2 reasons. First reason was that there was nothing in Markov's behavioral profile, either at Verification 7 or during the 3 days at Kethelvar, that was consistent with psychological damage, dissociative disorder, or impaired threat assessment. She was not confused about the situation. She was not operating under emotional dysregulation. Her judgment, as far as I could assess it, was intact throughout. She had correctly assessed the engagement, correctly assessed the withdrawal of her operators, correctly assessed the custody situation, and correctly assessed the respiratory complication in the adjacent cell. She was not malfunctioning. She was functioning exactly as she appeared to be designed to function. The second reason I rejected the pathology theory was the 117 cases. A pathological behavior does not appear consistently across that many separate incidents involving different individuals in different theaters under different operational conditions. A pathological behavior clusters around individuals or specific units under specific stressors. 117 incidents, widely distributed across 9 years of record, is not a cluster. It is a baseline. I told the council that my formal recommendation was threefold. First, that the Dominion's Behavioral Science Division open a formal research track on this specific behavioral tendency, and that the Kethavar 4 suite be updated to include a new motivational category, one that does not resolve care and harm into opposing vectors, but acknowledges the possibility of a species in which both drives can be genuinely active simultaneously and genuinely directed at the same object. Second, that Dominion Field Command be formally advised, through appropriate channels, that human medical personnel represent a distinct and unresolved threat classification problem, not because they are dangerous in the conventional sense, but because their presence in a contested zone introduces behavioral variables that our existing prediction models cannot process. They will behave in ways that our models will flag as irrational. Those behaviors will often be, by their own internal logic, entirely rational. We need models that can read that logic. Third, that Korbmasem Selamarkov be repatriated. The council chair asked me why. I told him that holding her would not produce data we could not generate through the analysis we already had. I told him that she had behaved with complete integrity throughout her time at Kethelvar, that she had caused no problems. She had in fact identified a medical complication in the facility that we had missed. I told him that the extended detention of a human medical officer who had treated Dominion casualties at personal risk was not a posture that would serve the Dominion's long-term interests. He asked me if there was another reason. I said, "She helped my trooper live." He was quiet. I told the council that the Peleth Tsar was returned to active service 14 weeks after Vareth Station 7. His limb assembly made a complete functional recovery. The medical report attributed this in part to the quality of the initial field stabilization, which had been performed under adverse conditions without species-specific calibration data, and which had, by any reasonable assessment, been better than adequate. The council voted 4-3 to recommend repatriation with a standard debrief requirement. I filed my supplementary report, Annex D, the following morning. It contains my formal request for the creation of the new behavioral category. I have given it a provisional designation in the interim, pending whatever formal nomenclature the Behavioral Science Division chooses to assign. I called it provisionally active bilateral care. The name is clinical, and it is probably not the name that will survive the review process. But what I needed it to capture was this: care that does not require the recipient to be an ally. Care that is active rather than obligatory, not performed because a rule demands it, expressed because the drive to perform it is present and real, and does not check the uniform first. Care that is bilateral in the sense that it is not conditioned on reciprocity, on the recipient being a member of the group that cares, on the recipient having earned it, on the recipient being likely to return it. We have no record of this in any other species. We have 117 field incidents, suggesting it is consistent, widespread, and species level in humans. I do not know what to do with that. I have been a field surgeon for 11 years, and I treated a Dominion casualty for 42 minutes next to a human corpsman who was treating a different Dominion casualty, and at the end of it both patients lived. And she looked up at me with the particular expression of someone who has finished a difficult piece of work and found it satisfactory, and she said something the interpreter rendered as, "Good work." She meant it. That is the thing I cannot classify. She meant it. I want to add one thing to this record that is not in the formal annexes, because it belongs here and nowhere else. In the weeks between the debrief and the filing of my supplementary report, I thought often about a conversation I had with Peleth Tsar before he was transferred to the recovery facility at Domreth Vel. He was coherent by then. The neural stabilization had held, the vascular pressure had normalized, and he had been moved from intensive status to standard observation. I sat with him for a little while. I do not know why. Partly professional habit. Partly, I think, because I had spent so much time reviewing the recordings that the ward at Domrathvel felt like the end of a long story, and I wanted to be there when it closed. He asked me, first, whether the human had been all right. He meant Markov. He had known she was taken into custody. He had been conscious when the QR unit arrived, barely, but enough to see it happen, and he wanted to know whether she was all right. I told him she was being repatriated. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that was the right call. I asked him what he meant. He said, "You don't hold on to someone who did what she did." I asked him what he thought she had done. He was quiet for another moment. He was still in some pain. His face showed it around the edges. Particular tightness that field. Personnel develop as a mask for discomfort that is present but manageable, he said. She came through the door, and I was the most badly hurt person in the room. That's all she saw. I was on the wrong side of the room, wrong uniform, wrong flag. But I was the most badly hurt person, so that was where she went. He said it without particular emotion. He was a field trooper, not a philosopher, and he was not trying to make it profound. He was reporting it the way he would report any tactical observation. He said, "I've been shot at, and I've been helped after seeing shot, and I know which one stays with you." That was all he said about it. I thought about his words during the drive back to Vethori Karath. I thought about them during the 2 weeks I spent compiling the supplementary annexes. I thought about them when I filed the request for the new behavioral category. And I kept arriving at the same uncomfortable question, is this. If Markov's behavior at Vera Station 7 represents a genuine species-level tendency, if human medical personnel, across 14 contested zones and 9 years of record, have been doing this consistently without anyone in our command structure noticing that they were doing it consistently, then what else have we been missing? Not in the records, I mean in the field. How many Dominion personnel, over 9 years of contested zone operations, have been treated by human medics and filed a routine post-incident report that nobody thought to read as evidence of anything? How many of them, like Pelithsar, have left the experience thinking about it without knowing that there was a name being assembled for what had happened to them? How many of them have sat in a recovery ward somewhere and been asked what the human did and said, approximately, "She came through the door and I was the most badly hurt person in the room, and that was all she saw"? I do not raise this as a sentimental observation. I raise it because the 117 cases in Annex C are the cases that made it into field ports. The cases that felt notable enough to a field officer to write down. The cases where the behavior was dramatic enough, or the circumstances unusual enough, that someone thought to record it. What the records almost certainly do not contain is the ambient baseline, the lower intensity incidents, the briefer contacts, the moments that resolved quickly and were too minor to seem worth reporting. The 117 are probably the peak of a much larger distribution. That is not a finding. It is an inference, but I believe it is a sound one, and I have included it in Annex D because the Council should understand the scale of what we may be dealing with. The Council Chair, when I told him this during the final portion of my debrief, asked me what I thought the scale was. I told him I did not know. I told him that was why I was recommending the research track. He asked me what the research track would tell us that the 170 cases and the Kethavar 4 output had not already told us. I told him it would tell us the conditions under which the tendency modulates, because it does modulate. Markov had said so herself in the interview. Resource constraints shift the priority. Active hostile contact can suppress it. A direct order from a commanding officer can constrain it, though the constraint is not absolute, and the word she had used was way. These are inputs. The question is how the inputs interact. Which combinations of conditions reliably suppress the behavior, which reliably amplify it, what the outer bounds of the definition of patient actually are. Sathorvath said, "You want to know how far it extends," I said. "I want to know whether there is a limit." He said, "You think there might not be," I said. "I think if there is one, we do not yet know where it is. And until we know where it is, we cannot predict behavior accurately in any contested zone scenario involving human medical personnel. Our models will be wrong. Not slightly wrong, structurally wrong, because we are missing the variable entirely." He looked at the table for a moment. He said, A species that might have no limit on who it considers a patient. He said it slowly. The way you say something that you are still deciding whether it frightens you, I said. I am recommending we find out, he said. And in the meantime, I said. In the meantime, we stop filing these incidents as standard post-incident notes and start reading them. The council voted on the research track the following morning. The vote was unanimous. I note this not because a unanimous vote was required. A simple majority would have carried, but because in my experience of Dominion Council, seatings, unanimous votes are uncommon on matters that are genuinely open to interpretation. When a council votes unanimously on something, it usually means that whatever was described to them in the preceding session was sufficiently unambiguous that the room stopped having an argument about it. I do not know whether the council was unanimously in favor of the research track or unanimously disturbed by the question, both simultaneously. I suspect it was both simultaneously. I know that feeling. I had it, standing in the primary assessment room at Vareth Station 7, watching Markov work. The room was quiet by then, the fighting done, the operational chaos settling into something post-operational, the particular flat silence that follows a sharp engagement. She was on the floor, and her patient was in front of her, and her hands were moving with the kind of precision that takes years to build and does not announce itself. She was entirely unconcerned with me. She was entirely unconcerned with the 4 armed members of her team maintaining positions at the exits. She was entirely unconcerned with the fact that the man in front of her had been, roughly 2 minutes before she arrived, attempting to kill those 4 people. He was hurt. She was a medic. I have no additional language for it. I have reviewed the recordings 47 times and sat with the interview transcripts and compiled 4 annexes and drafted a formal request for a new behavioral category, and at the end of all of it, I still have no language for it that is not at its base those 2 sentences. He was hurt. She was a medic. The entirety of the Dominion's behavioral science apparatus, 400,000 profiles, 43 years of data. The categorize 4 classification suite could not produce a 3rd sentence that explained the connection between those 2 facts in a way that fit our existing framework. We will need a new framework. I have made the recommendation. I have filed the request. I have told the council what I saw and what it means and what I think we should do about it. What I have not told the council, what I did not put in any of the annexes, because it is not the kind of thing that belongs in a behavioral science report, is the other thing I thought about during the drive back to Vithori. I thought about Peleth Sar asking if the human was all right. He had been barely conscious when the QR unit took her into custody. He had been in significant pain. He had just survived a severe injury in a contested zone, and his first recoverable moment of coherent thought had been to ask about the person who had kept him alive. Not his unit status, not the operational outcome. Whether the human was all right, I do not know what to do with that either. Both of them were doing the same thing, I think, from opposite directions. She went to the most badly hurt person in the room, because that is where a medic goes. He asked after the person who had stayed when she could have gone, because that is what you do for someone who did that for you. I am not a behavioral philosopher, and I am not going to dress it up as more than it was. But I keep thinking that what I watched in that room and in the recovery ward and across 2 interview sessions and 47 reviews of the same 11 seconds of sensor footage was something the Dominion's models were not built to see. Not because it was hidden, because we were not looking. We have been looking at humans for 43 years, and we have been looking at the right things. The speed, the violence, the endurance, tactical intelligence, the physiological resilience. These are the things that generate threat ratings. These are the things that inform engagement protocols. We have looked at them carefully and at length, and we understand them well. We were not looking at what they do when the shooting stops. We were not looking at the 11 seconds. That is what I am recommending we change. The formal debrief closed with Ovrath Dim thanking me for the thoroughness of the report and indicating that the Behavioral Science Division would be in contact regarding the research track parameters within 30 days. The meeting dispersed. I gathered my materials. I walked out through the antechamber of the council room at Vethori Karath into the corridor outside. Was long and pale and very quiet at that hour, and I stood there for a moment before I could make myself start walking. 47 reviews. Still, did not fully understand it. I am not sure understanding it is the point. I think the point is that it exists, and it is real, and it is consistent, and it is, by any honest assessment of the evidence in front of me, a genuine and fundamental feature of how humans are built. Not a policy, not a training artifact, not a tactic, a feature. They go to the most badly hurt person in the room, whoever it is. That is what the new category needs to capture. Whatever we call it, when it has a real name and a real classification code and a place in the Kethavar 4 library. They go to the most badly hurt person in the room. We have the reports now. We have the recordings. We have 117 cases and a forward software output and a provisional behavioral category that does not yet have a permanent name. We have everything except 43 years of looking in the right direction. I suppose that is where we begin.